thank you very much for coming along once again this evening. It's an important evening in Boston, and many would argue around the world, I guess, because they're playing a game someplace in the United States, and a lot of people are attentive to the importance of that game. And I'm going to try to present something anyway on Super Bowl Sunday that isn't quite in the same vein, but in fact has to do with Boston Patriots, with New England Patriots, with Patriots all over the United States, and in fact with everybody all over the world. I realize there may be other programs that are competing for attention at this point in the afternoon, Super Bowl Sunday, but we're up against problems that I'm going to try to discuss here that in fact are going to make the outcome of any Super Bowl pale by comparison. We're in fact looking at problems that we're going to have to face here in Boston, all throughout the United States, especially along the coastlines, but then around the world as well. So, we're looking at mapping an uncertain future. Place, space, and sea level rise in the Post-Columbian city. It's hard to remember what the Post-Columbian city is because we've never really studied it as that. Basically, cities that are Post-Columbian cities are those that were put in place after Columbus ran into the New World. He often claims to have found the New World, but he didn't find it because it wasn't lost. It represents a certain chapter in European ignorance that it comes to a gradual end as more of the world is taken into account, but it takes several hundred years for that reality to dawn upon the European consciousness. And in fact, in the meantime, a great deal of human activity is organized in the post-Columbian world, and in cities in particular that are located along coastlines. It's no accident that happens, because you got here in a boat. And boats run at sea level. Cities organize themselves around estuaries and rivers that feed into the sea. So the rise of the post-Columbian city is pretty dramatic after 1492, but we're just realizing that we're mapping an uncertain future if we think that place and space are going to mean the same thing as sea level rises in the post-Columbian city. It's not going to mean the same thing. As we found out this winter, Winter Storm Grayson kills at least 700 more flights canceled as Northeast digs out. Okay, well that was part of the problem on the Weather Channel as it was reported, Northeast digging out, but only part of the problem for coastal cities, the post-Columbian cities. Here the threat of rising sea levels hits home. According to the headlines in the Boston Globe, floods seen as a warning of Boston's future. And then there's, appropriately, a man walking around pulling a rubber dinghy in water that has risen up the lamppost quite significantly, indicating what's coming in Boston's future. Already here dramatically. Even to the financial types, it's apparent. The Wall Street Journal carried the title, "Boston Agonizes over how to protect itself from future storms." Similar photo, in fact, probably taken from the same source. A firefighter wades through floodwaters on Long Wharf in Boston during a winter storm on January 4th. Associated Press was the source of the photo used in both the Globe and the Wall Street Journal. Very interesting subtitle as it goes on to be part of the text. and you should look at the whole text. It's very worrisome in a way. As it says in the subtitle, cities that design protections for past floods find future ones may be worse. But changes carry huge price tags. Now, I suppose because it's the Wall Street Journal, you'd expect them to raise the price tag question, right? These are publications, the Wall Street Journal, for investors, right? So their concern is not human suffering, not the disaster that it means for ways of life of people, but the price tags. As if all human endeavor can be measured in price. Well, those of you who've been watching this program over the last 10 years realize that we've been dealing with this for a long time. But there's a new organization getting going called Climate Boston that you ought to be aware of. It's getting a new view on an enduring problem. The enduring problem has been dealt with over the years here on CCTV, and we put it in terms of, most recently, are you climate ready, Boston? It's the 237th program from Cambridge Community Television on the impact of climate and environmental issues on public policy. But it posed the question very clearly, are you climate ready? It's in quotes for a very good reason. That's in fact a phrase that's used by Massachusetts politicians to declare that Boston is climate ready. In fact, they published a little pamphlet on it. It's more than a little pamphlet, actually. It's a rather important study that you ought to get a hold of. But the question is not only for Boston, obviously. It's also true for New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. Why not internationally? Of course, London, Hong Kong, Lagos, Cairo. All of these, except for Cairo, Hong Kong, and London, are post-Columbian cities. The ones that are pre-Columbian, London, Hong Kong, Cairo, were at sea level at the time of Columbus and adjusted to sea level changes prior to that. Anyway, you can trace back through the old stories. This was 237, 234, tracing the past and envisioning the future, mapping the Earth for human survival in a climate-changed world. We're in a climate-changed world, and we need to start redrawing the maps, because our maps may not be up to date. Program number 226 dealt with time and tide wait for no man, rethinking Boston by the sea, examining whether in fact the New Yorker cartoon with a man sitting on the beach holding up a clicker as if he can click off the scene, just like he can click off the channel on his TV or switch channels from the Super Bowl to something else if he doesn't like the ads. Can't do that with sea level rise. Can't just click it away. Won't happen. Can't happen. Question we posed then was, is Boston better prepared for the future than New York was for Sandy? Big question. Program number 197, going even further back, was looking at adapting to climate change now. Climate experts, civil society, and plans for the transition to a sustainable Boston were discussed then, with public health officials and climate officers like John Bolduc from Cambridge. A sober look at what's going to happen to Logan Airport under the new sea level rise scenarios. And then way back, program 154, we looked at climate problems, false solutions, real problems, but false solutions. The idea of building a dam around Boston was looked at. And the whole geoengineering approach to sea level rise, that all you have to do is build storm barriers. Not quite true, because sea level rise is not the same as storm surge. It's true that storm surge makes you aware of sea level rise. And that storm surge is what happened in Boston at the beginning of this month, actually the beginning of last month in January. And it's that storm surge that led to those scenes on the wharfs where the firemen were waiting. But that storm surge is more severe because of the rising sea level. That's taking place on a regular and continuous basis, but not a graduated basis. That is to say, it's not happening on a steady basis, it's happening on an exponential basis. Exponentially, it's expanding more and more rapidly. Well, back in 2014, we were looking at, in 141 CCTV program, we looked at the 3 stages of climate vulnerability and preparedness. Planning for resilience and adaptation. There's emergency response, which we certainly saw at the beginning of January, as storm surge overwhelmed Boston streets. But then there's a larger set of problems, a vulnerability and preparedness analysis that needs to be undertaken, needs to take place. And we're about in that circuit now, that kind of circle or sphere of consciousness. We're realizing our vulnerability and need for preparedness, and we're starting to do the analysis for that. But we haven't moved to the next stage, which we're going to have to move to very quickly, which is resilience and adaptation planning. We're going to need to plan cities for resilience. We're going to need to build adaptation into the planning process, the building process, the zoning process, the school siting process, the water provisions, the sewage, the transportation systems. All of these need to be built in from now on in. They should have been built in for decades. But if we're going to think of resilience and adaptation, that planning is going to, from now on in, have to be component of everything as an aspect to responding to climate change. Well, in our program even earlier than that, we looked at life's a beach, sea level rise, and the global coastal crisis. Now, we put this back in geologic perspective in that program, and you should keep that in mind. Ice ages have come and gone. Ice sheets have proceeded into continental U.S. and receded. Procession and recession of ice sheets is a regular phenomena in geologic history for the last million years or so. About every 10,000 years, there's a procession of an ice sheet, and then it's recession. But when ice recedes, guess what? Sea levels increase. Pretty logical. When you have the water bottled up, as it were, or captured in the form of ice, there's less of it in the oceans. But when the ice disappears, that water melts into the oceans and give sea level a rise. Now, this is why we should spend time thinking about what's going on in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, where we're getting melting rates that are absolutely staggering, unprecedented as rates. And that's what's contributing, along with thermal expansion, to the rise in global sea levels. Even before that, we had a program focused on reviewing Boston by the Sea and took a look at what the flood maps look like. We need to really rethink our mental maps of what Boston is going to be, Boston by the Sea, if the sea overtops the Charles River Dam. Then Boston by the Sea takes on a very different set of proportions. And we're doing it along with New York, Cambridge, and Boston. There's been a very important exhibit down in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art, envisioning the coastal future. And trying to provide maps for it, so people could get their mental maps readjusted to reality maps. And of course we began this series back in 2009, even though it wasn't posted on YouTube until YouTube developed the MP4 format for sharing. It wasn't posted until 2013, but the program was put out in 2009 on Time and Tide, Wait for No Man, The Unstoppable Rise of Global Sea Level. So none of this is news to anybody who's been following this program. In fact, it's not news to anybody who's been looking at maps. If you look at the early maps of Boston, you'll learn a lot. This is a map published by a French cartographer in 1758 called Plan de la Ville de Boston. And it's a very interesting map in that you can call it up from map collections these days and take a look at it. In fact, zoom in on it. I would urge you to do so, and you can start sort of seeing what parts of the map are still recognizable, like the Boston Common, for example. This isn't recognizable anymore. It was an old pond that was used as a mill. They had a dam across it, and they had a mill for grinding grain, among other things. But the wharfs are there, the very first ones, and it's very instructive to take a look around old Boston. This you can do in a number of detailed maps that, as I say, are given some information over in the legend to the map. You can take a look at individual parts of it and then read the legend in detail and see what in fact was being talked about. Most of the things that are shown up on the map are batterie de 25 pièces de canon. This is in French. Batterie de 16 pièces de canon. The French were obsessed with how many cannons were being placed in different parts of the town, because this was during the French and Indian Wars. Right? The map is drawn up by the French to figure out how vulnerable Boston is. Boston was very vulnerable to attack by the sea, but it also had some real problems, as you can see from the isthmus down. All it took was, in effect, the capacity to control that narrow neck of land, as well as attack from the ocean, and you control Boston. Now this is what a lot of the warfare around the Revolution depended on, and it's very interesting to go back through these old maps. This has been done very systematically and well in a series of publications. One called Mapping Boston, which is absolutely fantastic, is a collection of the historical maps of Africa. Beyond the initial colonial maps, the history of Boston is largely a history of land making, as Nancy Seasholes has pointed out in a very important book called Gaining Ground. That's to say, most of Boston is built on fill. It's not something that existed as terra firma before, but in the process, the Charles River itself was kind of invented. It was banked and it was channeled in very specific ways, and Carl Haglund has looked at this in very great detail. Both of these books are extraordinarily absorbing as historical studies, and something deserves your attention. More recently, the United States Geological Survey has done a very detailed study of the Lower Charles, as they call it, the Lower Charles watershed from 1630 to 2005. Worth looking into. It doesn't deal with the Sudbury River down here, nor with the Mystic River up here, but looks at the Lower Charles, which is one of the more important features of this promontory, Boston, as a harbor. There are other maps that you can get into and start looking at. And in fact, I urge you all to start doing this, because as sea level changes, you're going to need to learn how to map your area yourself. You can do this through a tool that the Massachusetts GIS, Geographic Information Systems program, has put online. It's an online mapping tool called Oliver. And you can click on it and go out to the website and actually start looking at what various parts of Massachusetts look like. You can zoom into various levels of detail. As you can see, it's prioritizing interstate highway systems here. But you get the point. You can click these boxes that will tell you different aspects that you want to bring into focus and start looking in detail, among other things, at the river system and the harbor system. Why? Well, because that's what's particularly vulnerable, being close to sea level. Now, this is a very valuable online asset that is going to be crucial for every high school student to learn about, and every college student and every citizen. This is the way you can get access to the information in your environment. Oliver, MassGIS, take a look at it. Another big asset is the Norman B. Leventhal Map Center over at the Boston Public Library. It has all of the historical maps that are the basis of those earlier studies. Furthermore, it has an extraordinary outreach program suggesting to school teachers, bring your class to our gallery and a learning center for one of the educational programs that they've already set up. And they're likely to have in the future new people employed, especially because of the importance of maps and helping people understanding what's about to happen for Climate Ready Boston. Climate Ready Boston also has a series of maps that you can click on. Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer, it's called. You can click on the assets there and see where the flood plain is likely to be. This might be of great importance to you. But what we've got to work on more generally is our mental maps. What kind of way do you make your sort of mental mapping of the world count? Do you know where you should go in the case of emergencies? Do you know what areas you should avoid? What kind of mental maps are you carrying around with you? Because we all engage in mapping the mind. Even if we don't spend a lot of attention on it, we all have subconscious maps. And those subconscious maps represent our subconscious denial and acceptance. The psychology of denial in response to climate change is pretty extraordinary, but one of the things that we don't do very well is respond to what we're going to need to cope with the climate change on our coasts, to live with a newly mapped world. These are difficult truths, and there is a group called the Climate Psychology Alliance now that's trying to bring attention to this. How ready are we for what Boston is agonizing over at this point? Not just in Boston, but around the country and around the world. Well, there are efforts in Boston, like the Climate Vulnerability course that the Beacon Hill Seminars is putting on this spring. But we've got to ask ourselves about mapping an uncertain future. Are you climate ready, Boston? Maybe not.
Tom Chomsky. You're watching Cambridge Community TV.